Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 16: Eternal Inflation and the Limits of Science. So, what is meant by inflation? If you hear the term these days, you usually connect it to economics, to the increasing prices also that we are currently experiencing, unfortunately. But in physics, you need something different than that. So what is meant by inflation in physics? I mean, it's a similar concept, but what you mean by this is the extremely fast expansion of the universe in the Big Bang. So there was a period. It is assumed today, so there's no clear evidence for it or no conclusive evidence of it, where the universe was expandingly in an extreme fast way, in extreme rapidly, faster than the speed of light in some cases. And this is believed to have happened in some state of our universe. And the reason why this is believed is because the universe appears to be more ordered than it should be, or under a usual expansion in the time span of 13.8 billion years that we assume now is the age of our universe. So this is the reason why we believe that such an inflationary phase took place. And there are certain parameters of these theories in which you can twist, and where you can get a prediction that the universe repeats itself, basically. And what happens there is that the Big Bang in this case was not the actual beginning of the world, it was only the beginning of our universe. So in this case there was a universe before the Big Bang, and this kind of crushed into, so I guess this is how it is expanded, it kind of fall into itself into one point, and from this one point the Big Bang happened and our universe was created. And therefore there's always this creation and annihilation or crunching back of the universe, and there are repeating cycles in which universes come to place and are removed again. So this solves not only this problem of our highly ordered universe, other than it is expected from other estimations, but it also solves another problem in science, and that's the fine-tuning problem. And this is the same case. I mean, if you look at this whole, it is really similar to what we discussed in some episodes before of the many worlds, or of multiverse. There's also in string theory, there's also the concept of multiverses coming up. So this is a pretty common concept. And if you look at this concept that is discussed there, or that's currently really popular in science or among scientists there, it is basically the same thing, just not at the same time. So where in general, when you're talking about multiverses, you say there are a million different universes next to ours at the same time, in the same, I mean, you cannot say at the same time because each universe would have its own time standard, so it doesn't really make sense to talk about it, but you do not still assume that it kind of has a time synchronicity. But in this case here, there was this universe, it crunched into a point, and from the Big Bang came our universe. So you have a sequence of universes, and the whole sequence you could describe then as this multiverse. But still, there is this fact of multiverses, and what is philosophically interesting on multiverses is that it solves this fine-tuning problem, because the fine-tuning problem is this question of how can it be that the parameters in our universe are so perfectly tuned to allow for human life. I mean, I made an episode on this. I think I made it on a German podcast, but if you want to hear more about it, there is a blog post about a fine-tuning problem on my Substack, also in English, so you can read it there. And there it is about this really nice feature of our universe that seems to be really nicely tuned for us to experience life, to be alive, to allow for life. For example, there's this weird feature that the energy levels, which we discussed in previous episodes, of carbon, they are at a certain point, which is just, if you put in the calculations and compute it, it's just okay, some number that comes out. You don't see any causation, you don't see anything why this number has to be it. It's just an result that you get, which is basically pretty random. But if you look, continue to look at it and see what really is needed to have life, then you see that carbon really needs to have an energy level like this for life to be able to exist. So this is a pretty interesting to see how finely tuned our universe is to allow for life. But this question is the question is then, how is that? How can it be? How can we explain it? How? And one solution to this, of course, is to say, yeah, well, there's not only our universe, but there are dozens, bajillion, many different universes that exist. And if you have randomly generated so many universes, chances are that in one universe it will all fit perfectly well. All right, I think it's time for a short break. So before we continue, just make me some short announcements. If you want to know more about Sci-Faith, I really encourage you to go to my website, sci-faith.de/en. There you can find out more about this podcast, about my book, and about my blog. So you can read my blog. All the articles are also now in English, so you can read all of them. Also the article which I described in the first episode. And you can also learn more about my book, which is now available in English. So I really encourage you to get it as an ebook and read it, because there really much about what we are talking about is really discussed in a deeper way, and you will understand, I think, a lot more of what I'm talking about if you really have grasped those concepts. Also, there is a new book out, my latest novel, or my first novel also, Alien Thoughts. You can get it on Amazon as an ebook, and I really encourage you to read it. It's really exciting. I have gotten a lot of feedbacks. People really like it, and so I really hope you read it and also give it a 5-star rating, because this always helps people to know what a book is, to understand if it is something for them. And really, if you have the time, I really ask you to write a review of it, such that people really can know what a book is about, know if it's something for them, and so more readers can get aware of this book and can get to enjoy it. It also, of course, all this also supports me in my work, also on this podcast. It gives me more flexibility to produce new episodes. So I really am hoping for your support. Also, if you have ideas or requests or something that you want to have covered in this podcast, feel free to contact me at sci-faith.de/en and then use the contact form. There you can also subscribe to the newsletter, where you will get some special materials. So in the newsletter I write some of the thoughts that are usually not fit for blog posts, but still very interesting topics. So if you want to get this or get news, what happens at Sci-Faith, what's new, what's up, then you will get the latest news. You will really get there, and then I really encourage you to subscribe to my Substack. With that being said, let's continue to the episode. This would take extraordinary many worlds or universes for this to make to work, but there's in general no limit to how many worlds there can be. But I think what it shows is that, in some degree, it really works at a limits of science and in the area of faith already. So many times I heard this argument made by believers who say, they believe, the scientists say it's some multiverse that is responsible for this fine-tuning problem or that solves this fine-tuning problem. And this is basically the same as believing in a God who created the world such that it perfectly fits. And this is really true to some degree, but the counterpoint many scientists have brought, which also has some truth to it, is, that might be, but there is really evidence for these multiverses. Of course, this evidence is already interpreted, so you have these facts and you interpret it in such a way, and then you get these multiverses, but there is still a correlation of the real theory and where you can really see how multiverses would come out of it kind of naturally, but it really is not baked into the equation. So I would say it's maybe something between, but it's also, if you have listened to the episodes before about interpretations, and there it's also clear that the interpretation, for example, the deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, they come because that's the worldview many of those who have these theories have. So the interpretations we get from our physical theories are closer to multiverses because that's the interpretation many of the scientists who bring forth these theories prefer. That's also the argument you can bring. So I think there's still a valid case to be made that this is the area of faith and not anymore of science, and that just as well as you can believe there's a God who created a perfect universe such that everything fits and life can grow there perfectly, just as well you can make the case that there are multiverses who account for this fine-tuning problem. Okay. But what I think is really the case here is that this is already, or what begins to happen here is that we are going beyond the realm of science, beyond the scope of in which science is defined, which is in the scientific method. So everything that can be proven using the scientific method. And the scientific method, for some, they say there's nothing else but what science can show. So nothing else but what the scientific method can show. But this itself is a statement that cannot be established scientifically. You cannot show that this is true, and therefore this statement itself contradicts itself. So it cannot really be true. So there has to be something more than science. There has to be something beyond the scope of science, something beyond the limits of science. And many don't believe that, especially in science, but that's the problem, because then you really don't realize once you have gone beyond the limits of science. And I think there are certainly limits of science, and I think, for example, Feynman already saw cosmology as not really scientific because it was for him beyond these limits, and at his time this was really true because there were no experiments that could be made confirming cosmological assumptions, and therefore one needed to say, that's not really science, that's some other thing. But I think even still today we have some measurements we can make, some facts we can obtain with which we can prove cosmological assumptions, but still there is really the limit of science in my eyes coming closer and closer, and this is really something we need to deal with. And with that, just as a small caveat, with this I do not say that science will soon reach its end or something like that. We will never be at the end of science. We will always find out new things. Many have said that we are closely to the end of science and we will finish soon, and studying physics does not make any sense because we are almost finished. Many have said that, and right afterwards, great new fields of science were explored and found. So that's not true, and I think it will never be true. But I think there is an area where the scientific method reaches its boundaries, where you cannot go beyond that. And where there is more, and if you don't believe that there's more than what we can know scientifically, then you go into danger to really don't realize when you have gone past that limit, and then you will call things scientific that are not at all scientific, and go in this area. So one example where I think that the limits of science are about to be reached is regarding consciousness. I think consciousness itself is not a purely scientific process. I think there's a spiritual component to it, and I think this is where we reach a boundary where many argue that consciousness is an emergent concept and stuff like that, which is already kind of hand-waving of saying, yeah, if you have that much nuance and particles and things together, something like consciousness just emerges out of the blue, which you could not see at individual neurons colliding or something like that. Which is really hand-waving. There's no clear equations behind it. It's just saying, yeah, it somehow occurs. It's kind of like in this cartoon where the creationist says, yeah, there's some miracle occurs, and then there's this universe. Somehow in the same way, many scientists are arguing now and saying, yeah, some emergence stuff occurs, and then there's consciousness. So, and this, I think the reason for this is, to some degree, that it is, of course, not at all understood what consciousness is, but also to some degree that it is, I think, not possible to understand consciousness in a purely scientific way, and it is beyond the scope of science itself. And therefore, if you try to understand consciousness by purely scientific means, you are deemed to fail. And you will not realize that you are past the boundary of science, since you have not, you do not believe that such a boundary exists, and then you are deemed to make assumptions or make your assumptions be scientific. You say you make assumptions and you say, yeah, this is science says so, because you have some evidence to on which you rely on this. And I want to move away from the topic of consciousness, because I think in a later episode we will look deeper into this. But to go back to cosmology, I think there you have the same area where you say, okay, we have some evidence that something like eternal inflation could occur in our universe, and then you say, okay, if we can prove or if we say internal inflation makes these and these predictions, which are nothing at all like, hey, eternal inflation is happening, but rather like some particles behaving in such and such a way, then some people are arguing, okay, this then proves that eternal inflation is a thing. But on the other hand, it could completely be that even with that description, that there is an alternative description which says these particles behave in such a way for a completely different reason. And there you see that the limits of science are reached there, and in this way the interpretation of the scientific facts and the facts themselves are in some way so much apart that you kind of cannot really talk anymore of saying that this interpretation is definitely true, because the facts are so far from it. But because how would you could not be really certain of something like eternal inflation to have occurred unless you have been there, and you could not have possibly been there. So this is, I think, the problem in which modern science is currently running. And I think if you read about topics that go in this direction, that go in such big models about eternal inflation, multiverses, consciousness, and so on, really ask yourself, if somebody writes about it, ask yourself first, how can they know this? And if they certainly will have facts that they use for their assumptions, but you will clearly see that those facts are not so close connected to their interpretations, that while their interpretations might really be valid, there clearly can be a completely different interpretation that would explain the same effect. And therefore, I think this is what, especially in these times, we need to be careful of when we are interpreting scientific findings, to separate this interpretation a scientist has to the facts that he presents or the findings that he presents from the real facts. That we have the separations and really understand, okay, while the facts are valid and true, apparently, there still can be a discussion about how to interpret these facts. As a final note on this, let me just say that the same problems that this eternal inflation seems to solve, so the problem of an universe which is more ordered than it is supposed to be, and this concept of the fine-tuning of the universe, both can be also perfectly explained by creation, by a creator who creates the world such that it perfectly fits life and such that it is perfectly ordered, or such ordered as it needs to be. So this is already a perfect explanation of this, and therefore it can be not only seen as something which needs to be described in such a theory, but also it can be seen as something which hints at an creator. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.